A couple of quick announcements. First off, we had our first quiz on Wednesday. I've got those graded. Your final grades are posted into the grade book on Brightspace on those. You guys might have also noticed yesterday that you couldn't necessarily immediately go in and take a look at those. Remember, I kind of delayed the feedback on any quizzes until Friday mornings. And the reason for that is sometimes I do have some people with some excused absence or anything where they can't take it on Wednesday for some reason, and then they have some time to take it on Thursday. The thought process here, though, is I can't have the quiz answers floating around in that meantime. So there's always a little bit of delay before you can see the answers on the quizzes and see some feedback on those quizzes. In general, the class did very well on the quiz. I think it is a pretty high average for it on it then. But if you have any questions about what questions you might have missed, gotten wrong, what were the correct answers for some of these? Or if there were some quiz questions you got right, but you just weren't sure about, and you want to see what kind of my answers were on that, you can actually log back into those quizzes. So I'm going to send instructions for how to view feedback on quizzes here after class today. It's just be a Word document that kind of goes through things step by step to see assessment on quizzes, on Dropbox items, on some other things as we go through the semester. But really what you're going to do is just click back on quiz number 1. And when you click onto that item, you have to click down on a drop down arrow, kind of looks like a triangle with that one. And you actually are just going to view your attempts. So there's usually on that drop down arrow somewhere about view attempts, and then you just actually go in and click on your attempt. When you click on that, you are going to see the questions, you're going to see your answer and the correct answers as well as they differ. If you also, with each individual question, there is then a feedback button. You can click on that as well. Under that feedback button, it's not going to be immediately visible, but under that feedback button, if you click on that for each question, you will kind of see my version of an answer for that question. Even with the multiple choice questions, for many of them, if you go and click on that overall feedback, I usually will have a description for why a particular answer choice was correct, or maybe then some other answer choices were wrong, for instance. So there is feedback embedded into those quizzes, so you guys can see kind of not only what my answer was, but then often what the thought process was then as well. And even with the Punnett squares, hopefully the images show up okay, but I even put in images of what the Punnett square would look like when you complete it. Questions about that? If you have any problem at all seeing the feedback, that's okay. It is not the most intuitive. It is just a little bit hidden. Once you get used to doing it, it's fine. But if you have any trouble viewing the feedback, just let me know, and we can. You can stop by my office, maybe bring your laptop or tablet or something. We can run through and just show you real quick. It doesn't take very long. It's just not always, Brightspace is pretty good. There are just, and usually it's pretty intuitive and easy to figure out how to do something. This is one of those things where I think it's not necessarily the easiest. All right, otherwise, I'm going to send out instructions for how to view feedback on quizzes. I'm actually also going to post some assignments for next week then as well. So I'm still working with the bookstore to try to get the whole lab manual thing figured out. So I am going to post and email out the lab number 2 activity today. So I'll have that posted. The other thing I'm going to get posted today is the pre-lab quiz number 2. So that's not up, but it's ready to go on Brightspace. I'm going to get it up right after class then as well today. That is due Tuesday before lab class, but I'll have both of those up on Brightspace for those of you that don't have the lab manuals, so have access to everything. And then there will be that pre-lab quiz for you guys to work on as well, and that's due Tuesday. And again, Wednesday next week, we'll have our next lecture quiz. So a lecture quiz number 2, just very similar to what you did on Wednesday, but that'll be another one of those on Wednesday next week then as well. Question about what's coming up? Okay. Otherwise, today we're going to start talking about evolution. So a lot of what we've been talking about so far has been set up for then how we're going to look at evolution and explain what evolution is. But in this particular lecture set, we're going to talk about what is evolution. We'll even talk about Darwin and kind of the history behind how he first described evolution. We'll talk about processes that drive evolution, like natural selection and what is natural selection. But then we'll also talk about sometimes some limits on natural selection and why natural selection, if it's always constantly selecting for the most beneficial traits in a population, why does it not simultaneously eliminate variation? Instead, natural selection often promotes variation in populations. So we'll talk a little bit about the kind of dichotomy between that then as well. And then we'll talk very quickly through a number of different types of evidence for evolution. Evolution is something that has held up in thousands and thousands and thousands of experiments that have been done. There's a very broad range of evidence that supports evolution then as well. So evolution, we're going to basically go through this in detail, but I will start off with just saying evolution. I'm going to give you a few different definitions for it. Now, when we describe what evolution is, it's just changes in populations over time, over generational time. What it is it's changes in the genetic and trait composition, the genetic composition of a population, the trait composition of a population, from one generation to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next. But I really also kind of just call that over generational time. One generation to another. So we're looking at changes in a population over time. And an even simpler definition of evolution is descent with modification. That you have ancestors, they have kids, grandkids, great-grandkids. So you have descent. You've got ancestors that produce descendants of those ancestors, but the descendants are not identical to the ancestor populations. They are similar, but modified versions of those ancestor populations. And we can have a number of different examples of this, but for instance, humans have actually, at least in the US, have gradually been getting shorter since the 1980s. Probably not something you guys have heard about. There's actually a story on NPR about it this morning. When I was just driving in, so I'm like, I'm going to talk about that today. But anyways, there is a number of different ways we can say descent with modification, and we'll give a number of different examples of this then as well. Now, with evolution, we're also going to talk about evolution at a couple different levels of organization. There are different kinds of evolution or different ways to look at evolution. There's microevolution. This is going to be changes in allele frequencies within a population over time. Remember, with evolution, we're always, I'm going to hit this a couple times. We're talking about changes in a population of organisms. What's a population? All the members of the same species interacting within an area. So when we're talking about evolution, it's always changes in a population over time, okay? Not changes in an organism over time. And in fact, organisms don't typically change much. Okay, we're looking at changes in a population over time, but specifically microevolution, we're really looking at one population and changes in some of the allele frequencies within that population over time. This is going to focus on processes that directly drive evolution, change in that population. And those processes that we're going to talk about in this lecture set are things like natural selection, but then also genetic drift then as well. And we can also hear later in the class, so this lecture set we're going to go through is mostly microevolution to begin with. Later in the class, we're going to start taking a look at more macro evolution. And this is going to be broader patterns of change above the species or population level. This is going to be like co-evolution of species, for instance, how one species can affect the evolution of another species. So we're looking at it beyond the population level, but it's also going to look at things like taxonomy, grouping organisms into how they're evolutionarily related to one another. So taxonomy is creating groupings of organisms like the animals and basically kind of seeing how they're related to one another. So sometimes we take a look at that. So we're going to take a look at that later in the semester. We're also going to talk about speciation events. And this is more of a macro evolution topic as well. But that is going to look at the formation of new species that did not previously exist then. So that's what we're looking at with speciation events. And we will talk specifically about speciation and how new species form. Now, with some of this though, some historical setup, there's a lot of history when it comes to biology. And so you probably have all heard of Charles Darwin before. So Charles Darwin is credited with first coming up with the theory of evolution. And so he lived from 1809 to 1882. He actually studied medicine and at first unsuccessfully. And then ended up attending instead Cambridge University to become a clergy. And he, there worked under Reverend John Henslow, kind of became one of his proteges, one of his students. And John Henslow was a very famous professor and scientist and clergyman at the time. And there's a number of different scientific researchers that kind of trace their lineage to kind of his teaching then as well, and his help getting them kind of established and networked out with other people. He's pretty famous in and of his own right. At John Henslow's kind of encouragement, Darwin, after graduating, took an unpaid position as a naturalist on a 5-year sailing journey around the world on a ship called the Beagle. And what his job was on the Beagle was basically as a naturalist. He collected specimens of plants and animals, preserved them, boxed them up. And the idea was they were supposed to be stored and then brought back. They were supposed to be collected, dried, stored, categorized, taking notes on all this stuff. And then the idea is to bring them back to England at the time for preservation and study and maybe even like museum pieces and things like that. So his job was really to collect all these plant and animal samples, characterize them, classify them, describe them, bring them back at the end of then the journey. And while going on the Beagle, they sailed out of Great Britain. They went around South America, spent some time going around kind of the southern parts of South America. They came back up the western coast of South America, hit the Galapagos Islands, which is one of the places where Darwin spent the most time collecting samples from. And actually based a lot of his ideas about evolution on those specimens that were collected from the islands. By the way, islands are heavily studied when it comes to evolution. And that is because what you get is plants and animals will actually undergo these migration events from one island to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next. But as they have these kind of what are founder population, usually what happens is a small founding population breaks off of one island and goes to a new island. But the two islands don't always have the same environment. And you actually had a small founding population, and what they end up doing is they end up diverging and changing. And so at one island, they might get certain types of changes, but at other islands, they get other different kinds of changes. And so island biogeography is something we're going to talk about later in this lecture set. But island biogeography is heavily used to study evolutionary events and speciation events, for instance. And we're going to talk about that as well. And that's probably one of the reasons why Darwin so heavily focused on the Galapagos Islands then as well. With this one, Darwin was collecting samples, and he noticed a few different things. He noticed that most organisms had traits, or what are called adaptations, and I'll come back to that term here in a second, that made them suited to their environment in some way. They possessed some traits or characteristics that help them be successful where they were. And what he did is he called these adaptations. Adaptations, again, there's some type of characteristic of an organism that enhances their survival or their reproduction or both in some type of specific environment. So the adaptations help them be successful, help them survive, help them reproduce in some way. And there's a lot of different examples of adaptations. You even have the fact that, I don't know, like cactus plants can store water. So that if it ever rains in the desert, an area where they grow, doesn't rain very often, but if it does rain, they gobble up as much of that water and they can store it. Same thing with camels and the humps on their back. They are, if the camel has access to water, they store as much of it as can. So there may be water storage adaptations, for instance. One of the things that Darwin looked at was what are called Galapagos finches or Darwin finches. And he found on different islands, the beaks of some of these finches were different. So for instance, he had some birds that were cactus eaters on these Galapagos Islands, and they actually had a beak that was long and narrow, but it was good for puncturing into the cactus to get at the watery pulp inside of it. So it helped them kind of drill a hole into the cactus and get to that inside portions where the water they wanted was. You had other finches, very similar, but they have differently shaped beaks. Their beaks were very broad, but also more powerful. They had more muscles, and they were seed eaters, for instance. So their beak morphology was different to take advantage of that different food source more successfully. And he had birds that were insect eaters. Again, he noticed that their beaks were also different shaped. They had long, narrow beaks that were also serrated. You guys know what serrated is, or a serrated knife? It's the one that has kind of a series of points to it. And the birds that were insect eaters had these serrated beaks. And the idea is they could grab an insect, the serrations would sink into it and help it so the insect could not wriggle away and get free. It helped them capture their food, for instance. So these are all examples of adaptations. The serration on these bird beaks help them be more successful in catching their main food source, which was insects as well. Questions about that? Okay. Now, what Darwin did is, and I'm going to go through Darwin's observations here in a little bit more detail, but he actually proposed that species populations could change slowly over time. And he was actually influenced by the field of paleontology at the time. He actually had several colleagues that were paleontologists, and they were looking at fossils and fossil records. And one of the big things that was a big argument at the time was this idea of what is called catastrophism versus uniformitarianism, which is a mouthful. What a lot of paleontologists noticed when they were studying the fossils, that they were laid down in sediment layers. So as you dug down through the rocks and soil, they would see layers. Anybody ever seen like the striations or layers on rocks that you can see exposed? So there's a big argument over how do you get layering? How do you get these sediment layers and some other stuff? Yeah.
So the sediments over time go this way.
Mm-hmm.
As we describe the maximum as they can. Always
In layers. And that is describing more what is called uniformitarianism, that you get erosion and layering kind of uniformly over time then as well. But at that time, uniformitarianism was actually considered controversial. A lot of early paleontologists thought it was catastrophism, and the idea is those layers represented different catastrophes like floods and volcanic eruptions or something like that, that the layers were put down in catastrophic events. And each layer represented a different catastrophic event, and that's not actually what it is most of the time. That does, and both of them do happen sometimes, yes. You have some floods or some volcanic eruptions that might create sediment layers, but usually most layering is due to uniformitarian. Slow change over time and erosion and things like that. And what Darwin really just took away from this is if you could have slow change over time in geology, why couldn't you have slow change over time also in biology then as well? that organisms were not static, that they did change over generations. This was not new. Darwin was not proposing anything that other scientists hadn't already proposed. So for instance, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, he actually hypothesized also that species change over time. But his process for driving that change was not the same. Lamarck, what he actually proposed was that there is this use and disuse of body parts, and that was then affected the inheritance of what is called acquired characteristics. By the way, this is wrong. Okay, the reason you might not have heard of Jean-Baptiste Lamarck is because his version of how he thought evolution happened is incorrect. So there is not inheritance of acquired characteristics. Now, what do I mean by that, and how is it different from what Darwin proposed? So this is a specific example from a different textbook. I like their older figure, and the older figure had dead giraffes over here at the end, but anyways. With this one, Lamarck and Darwin both proposed mechanisms for biological organisms changing over time, mechanisms for evolution, but they proposed different processes for driving that change. And if we look at Lamarck's proposal, which is incorrect and not accurate, Lamarck's proposal, if you look at, say, a population of giraffes, the giraffes maybe all had originally short necks and pretty uniform, but the giraffes were eating leaves off the trees. And what he proposed is the giraffes were constantly stretching their necks up to grab the leaves. And he proposed that because the giraffes were continually stretching their necks, in their own lifetime, the giraffe neck would get longer. But then that longer neck stretching was also acquired within their lifespan and then passed on to their offspring. And that is not what happened. So this was the idea of giraffes stretch their necks. They acquired that characteristic just a little bit. And just got a little bit longer, and they somehow passed that on to their offspring. And that is not what happened. So you do not have inheritance of acquired characteristics. What Darwin proposed is that there is just already variation in population. So you start off with some natural variation in population, that some giraffes had shorter necks, some giraffes had medium necks, some giraffes had longer necks. There was some natural variation due to just some different genetics in the population. But the longer necked giraffes could reach more leaves. They had access to more food. And as a result, the long-necked giraffes, if they just happened to randomly be longer necks, were more successful. They could eat more, they could survive better, but if they could eat more and survive better, they also reproduced better. They had more kids. And what that means is more long-necked kids in the next generation. But then you repeat that, not just through one generation, but a second, a third, a fourth, a fifth, a sixth, a 10th generation. And the idea here is that the long-necked individuals have an advantage. They survive better because they can get food. They reproduce better because of that as well. They have more kids. But you just repeatedly, the long-necked individuals have more kids for a generation. Then they also have all of those long-necked individuals have more kids into a second generation. All of those long-necked kids have more kids in the next generation. And the idea is that it will lead to giraffes having longer necks over time within the population. That over time, a greater percentage of the population will have longer necks. There will still be some variation in there, and if they have even longer necks, they would be then better represented in the next generation then as well. Really what Darwin was proposing is there's variation, and then it's just probability and math. That if somebody has an advantage, they're probably going to have more kids. And that's going to lead to those kids with that shared trait becoming more common over time with each round of reproduction. Question about that? All right, I'm gonna go through this in a little bit more detail with some more specifics. In 1844, Darwin then wrote an essay on the origin of species and natural selection, but he didn't publish it right away. He kind of sat on it, and not for a small amount of time. He sat on it for over a decade. So he had this kind of manuscript ready to go, but he kept adding more and more to it. He kept kind of working on it, and he didn't publish it until he basically got scared. In 1858, Darwin received a then letter and manuscript from Alfred Wallace, who had independently developed a theory of natural selection that was pretty much identical, an evolution that was identical to Darwin's. So he had actually done this. He sent it to Darwin because he knew that Darwin had been working on some stuff like this, but he was trying to get feedback on it before he sent it off to be published. And then, of course, Darwin got scared and immediately then went to publish his book instead. Now, he was nice. He actually told Wallace that he had this as well. He sent his manuscript back to Wallace. They agreed to publish at the same time in the same journals, in the same kind of sphere. So it turns out Darwin and Wallace, they didn't co-publish it, but they both independently published their theories at the exact same time. Anybody ever heard of Wallace? Yeah? Yeah, it's pretty rare. The reason that you guys maybe don't know Wallace, Darwin was actually nice, but Darwin had connections and Wallace did not. And so Darwin was actually well established in his field at the times. He knew all the big players, networked with all the big players. Wallace was much, much younger and didn't kind of have the pedigree and the background that Darwin did. And as a result of that, Darwin's mostly gotten credit for evolution over time, whereas Wallace has kind of been forgotten, unfortunately. But they both did publish at the same time, and Darwin didn't try to cut them out. It's just kind of what's happened in the history books, unfortunately. Questions about that? So in this one, what Darwin outlined and developed is two main ideas: descent with modification and natural selection. Interestingly enough, Darwin never uses the term evolution in any of his stuff. So what he never actually had the word evolution in. If you go read The Origin of Species, for instance, it's an entire book about this thick. It's big, huh?
Ancient English.
It is a little bit, yeah. But he actually never uses the term evolution. He didn't coin that term. Instead, what he described was descent with modification. But this is just, again, a version of a definition of that evolution term. And descent with modification, what does that really mean? And again, I've already kind of hit this, but it means organisms or species are modified versions of their ancestors. They're similar to the ancestors, but they are modified and different in some way. And Darwin had several different, and the idea here is that there are going to be disparate or different traits that arise over time in populations. Populations slowly change over time. You get trait differences over time. And again, here when I say time, I'm always meaning reproductive time or generational time. Populations going through several generations. Darwin had several different examples in this book. For instance, for things like elephant evolution based upon fossil records, for instance. And what he also proposed as part of this is that if you went back far enough, that all species also can probably be traced to a single common ancestral species if you go back far enough. What this also means is that Darwin was kind of proposing the idea of speciation, that not only could species evolve and change over time, but they could diverge into different species then as well. And we're going to talk exactly what is meant by the definition of a species here soon, but also how do new species form. We're going to hit that topic here a little bit later in class. Okay. So descent with modification is something that Darwin spends a lot of time, and he gives several different examples of this in his book. For instance, one of the things that he noticed is, again, some biogeography evidence, is he noticed that if he looked at an island, and then if he looked at the closest continental mainland, that if he found some species on the mainland, he found some similar but different species on the island. And what he proposed is that at some point there were species, plants and animals on the continent. They migrated to the island in some way. Maybe it was just birds flew over. Seeds floating through the ocean from a plant, for instance, then as well, or from birds ate some seeds, but they picked them up from the continental mainland and they dropped the seeds on the island, for instance. That they made their way over there, that things on the island often looked very similar to things on the continental mainland, but slightly different with different variations. And that was, he did a lot of time focusing on those types of examples then as well. So evolution then is going to be observable patterns of changes in populations over several generations. This is again a different way of saying descent with modification. Again, I like to give you guys several different definitions because a lot of times I'm focusing on you guys understanding the topic, understanding what we're talking about, rather than just memorizing it. What Darwin also focused in on, and what we're going to do some focusing on, is what mechanisms drive the process or cause the process of evolution, and what's going on here then as well. And what was Darwin's explanation for this process? We're then going to talk a little bit about how that has held up. Darwin's explanation for evolution has held up through experimentation time and time again. So to kind of go through Darwin's thought process, how did he kind of form the idea of then evolution, but also processes that drive evolution? Now, by the way, what is the mechanisms that drive the process of evolution? Random variation is going to be involved. Competition can be involved. Not always, but often is. Yeah, natural selection. So we're going to hit this one. So Darwin's explanation for this process of evolution was natural selection. And we're going to just talk about how that then takes place. But really, how did he come to this idea of natural selection? So Darwin had a lot of observations. So when he was going out and observing things, it's part of the first things he did. When he was looking at populations of organisms, he noted that individuals in a population can have traits that then vary. And the idea behind this is just like with my snails on my log here. They have different size of snails. Some are big, some are smaller. You have different shape of their shells, different colors to their shells, different spiral patterns to their shells. My snails here don't all look the same. They vary, or they have some different traits. Okay. When he notices that there is always trait variation. Things that are a little hard to see is some of these snails have left-handed spirals to their shell. Some of them have right-handed spirals to their shell. The snails are technically kind of left-handed or right-handed in some cases then as well. So, but there's variation within the population. Now, where do those varied traits typically come from that we've talked about already?
Their ancestors.
So they inherit, a lot of times they inherit versions of the traits from their ancestors. And anytime we're talking about inheritance, we're talking about most of the time, varied traits come from varied genetics or varied alleles, then genetic inheritance. Most traits are genetically controlled. So the other idea here is that these traits are typically heritable. What Darwin also described in his observations is that most of the time traits are inherited from parents to offspring. So offspring typically then look like the parents. They may not be identical to the parents, but usually offspring share traits with their parents. Okay, not all the time, but usually they do. Okay, one of the other things, so traits vary, traits are genetically controlled, traits are inherited. What he also saw is many cases that is if there are offspring produced, a lot of times more offspring are produced than survive to kind of reproductive age. So in many cases, you might produce offspring, but not all of those offspring are going to be successful and go on to reproduce themselves. An example, anybody ever stepped on like a puffball mushroom? You get that greenish cloud that kind of comes out of that. That's all spores or reproductive cells. And actually millions of them get released. But do you get millions of new fungi, little mushrooms produced? No, only a small fraction of those will actually grow up and live to become new mushrooms, for instance, and go on to reproduce themselves. One of the things they do is they just try to basically do it by sheer numbers, but the vast majority of those spores may never mature, for instance. Does that make sense, everybody? So a lot of them might die. And he noticed that with a lot of plants. They might have, for instance, seeds that are produced, but not all of those seeds are going to grow up to become a tree, for instance, only a fraction of them. And so he noticed that with a number of different even animal species, that not all of the offspring are going to survive. That, for instance, maybe half of a bird clutch isn't going to make it up to adulthood and go on to reproduce. And he attributed this largely to competition. It's not only due to competition. I'm going to describe that a little bit. But he actually basically said that competition, this could be competition for space, for food, could be competition even for mates. So there's a lot of sometimes sexual selection and sexual competition. That competition is inevitable. And what that means is not all offspring survive to reproduce. Not all offspring are going to go on to reproduce. And the other thing he noted is that, again, species typically have adaptations, possess adaptations to help them suit their environment or survive well within their environment in some way. So again, adaptations is some type of trait, feature, something an organism possesses that makes them successful in a particular environment. Okay, so these were a series of observations he made where Darwin then did is he kind of put them all together. And from that, he made some hypotheses or some inferences. So from all of those 5 points, the things he just observed happening out in the natural world, he proposed then that individuals that are best, I really almost kind of prefer better, suited to their environment are more likely to be successful and therefore also more likely to reproduce. I'm going to hit this a few times. Have it underlined as well. Evolution always hinges on reproduction. Evolution is always about reproduction and reproductive levels. What will also happen, though, is that offspring will share genetically inherited successful traits of their parents, usually, and thus go on to be successful themselves as well. And if this keeps repeating over many reproductive generations, then what will happen over time is those successful traits become more and more common, until maybe most of the members of a population have those successful traits. So those advantageous traits become increasingly common over the course of several generations. And what he just termed this was natural selection. In other words, the natural environment is selecting for beneficial traits. I'm not really actually all that crazy about that terminology. It's not, nothing is actively selecting for or against anything. It's just a matter of math and probability.
He also used,
Yeah, so environmental pressures is another way to kind of phrase natural selection. Yeah.
Is that why when we were looking in using is like
So yeah, that could be one. So we see most people in North and South America, for instance, are homozygous recessive for a little I allele, and therefore have then the recessive phenotype of type O blood. So especially in South America, it could be that there's an advantage to having type O blood in the Americas. But it could just be due to ancestral history and migration patterns as well. So there is, but we don't know for sure, but there's a lot of different competing theories as to what might be going on. So he did also sometimes just term this environmental pressures, as Raph said. And I will use that phrase a little bit then as well, is that the way the environment can influence or put pressure on how a species changes over time. And that is similar to this idea of the natural selection. It's kind of the same process. Just as an example of this, one thing I want to be, it's Darwin a lot of times talk about individuals that are better suited for the environment or selected for, but you can actually have selection against negative traits or selection for beneficial traits. So it's not just that it's necessarily better, you can have removal of negative traits as well. And so just as an example of this, you might have a species of beetle. And in my example here, you have variation of color. So you have kind of white beetles, you have black beetles, you have kind of grayish beetles. So you got a variation in the colors of my beetle population, but maybe they're living on a dark colored background. Maybe they're living on some black rocks or something like that. Maybe then a predator is in the area, a bird. Birds coming along and eating the beetles. How do birds find their prey? Looking. It's usually they're using their eyes to spot them, right? They're flying around and then they see them down below and swoop down and grab them. Okay. What kind of beetles do you think my bird is going to see a lot more easily? The white beetles, the ones that stand out and don't blend in. So they're going to see the white or lightly colored beetles. So it comes along, eats the white beetles. What that does is when it eats those white beetles, well, the bird gets a nice meal, beetle's dead, but it removes the beetle's genetics from the population. What is happening here, the alleles that are coding for white color are getting removed from the population. Okay, that changes the population's overall genetic patterns. And it basically what it does is it means less white colored alleles and more black colored alleles. For instance, more dark pigmentation. And then if you look, they reproduce and now my overall population is darker. But the bird might still be around, might still be picking off some of the light colored beetles. But the idea is it's removing those white alleles from the population, and over time, the population becomes increasingly darkly pigmented. Questions about that? What you're having here is simultaneously selection against the white coloration genes and alleles, but selection for the dark pigmentation alleles. With evolution, it's sometimes also described as, you probably heard this phrase, survival of the fittest. But if you guys hear fittest or fitness, what do you guys typically think of? Health,
Right.
strength. You think of maybe things like exercise or somebody's in good shape, right? That is not what fitness means in a biological context. So just, words can have different definitions, but we're looking at what the biological definition of fitness is. It's really basically, what is fitness? It's a measure of reproductive success. Or fit? It, in essence. So when we look at biological fitness, it's a measure of how well they reproduce. How well do they pass on genetics to a next generation? And in essence, often the more offspring that survive to reproduce, the more fit the original parent was. It's tricky though. Something like a dandelion might produce, like, you have the little dandelion fluff. Anybody blow those? All right. Those are hundreds of dandelion seeds there. So you might say, oh, really high fitness, but they don't invest very much in any of those seeds. So vast majority of those dandelion seeds are never going to make new dandelion offspring. So you gotta be a little careful with fitness sometimes. It's a measure of reproductive success, how many kids they have, but again, how well those kids also survive to go on to reproduce themselves. So it can be a little bit of a difficult thing to measure at times. So fitness, is that really necessarily describing survival?
Of a species.
But it's mostly focused on survival, yes, of a species or a population. Not necessarily survival of individual organisms. And that fitness definition is hinging not on living, but on reproducing. Okay, is the other thing that I want to say. So when I say that survival of the fittest, I don't really like that phrase that much, because really what evolution is focusing in is reproduction of the fittest. It's always evolution influences reproductive success. And so, for instance, why do we have cancer? Why isn't that cancer and natural selection has eliminated cancer in human populations? Because when do most people get cancer?
Later in life.
Late in life, when they've already had kids. Does evolution care about cancer if they've already reproduced? No, it doesn't, because it's about reproduction. So you have to there's some things that we can go through, but it always favors reproduction, not necessarily survival. Sometimes survival and reproduction go hand in hand. Yes, if they survive better, they can reproduce better. But not always do they go hand in hand. So again, success when it comes to evolution is reproductive success, fitness. What I really just want to point out is about reproductive success is what we're looking at. The other thing is, what is success when it comes to evolution? I tell you, just as a kind of a last thing for today, but just going to finish this up, is natural selection or environmental pressures, they favor whatever is the best available trait. It favors best available traits. What's the problem with that phrase, or what I'm trying to get at here? Well, the environment can change, and I'm going to hit that here next lecture. Is the best available trait the same thing as this is a really good trait? No, if you had bad trait number 1, bad trait number 2, bad trait number 3, and only a little bit bad trait number 4. What's favored?
Little bit better.
The little bit bad trait. You can only select for existing traits. And it doesn't mean that all of the existing traits are, it doesn't mean there's a good trait in the existing traits. It just means that there might be one trait version that's better than all the other bad trait versions. Okay, so it favors the best available trait, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's always going to favor a good version of a trait. Thanks, everybody. And I'm going to hit that next lecture and really what I mean by that. Okay, so just as a kind of all the way. Yeah, no, that's a good place. We'll stop there. I'll talk, we'll go back and review natural selection to start off lecture on Monday. And then we'll start talking about this idea of favoring the best available traits and natural selection a little bit more so.